On September 3, 1944, Second Lieutenant Thomas Brennan was leading a reconnaissance patrol through the Ardennes Forest when Private James Kowalski spotted the cave entrance. It was nothing remarkable, just a dark mouth opening in the hillside, partially obscured by autumn vegetation, the kind of geological feature that dotted the Belgian landscape. Kowalski pointed it out because that's what soldiers do. They notice things, they report things. They don't assume things are harmless just because they look that way. Brennan was 26 years old, from Portland, Oregon, son of a timber merchant. 2 years of college before the war, 15 months in combat across North Africa, Sicily, and now continental Europe. He'd learned to trust his instincts and the instincts of his men. Kowalski had good instincts. The kid was 19, from a farm in Iowa, could track a rabbit through snow, could sense when something was wrong the way animals sense storms. If Kowalski was pointing at the cave, there was a reason. The Ardennes in September was deceptive, beautiful even. The forest was thick with evergreens and oak trees. The air was cool, but not yet cold. The light filtered through the canopy in golden patterns that would have been peaceful if the war was NT still happening, if men weren't still dying on roads just kilometers away, if German artillery was still placing shells at coordinates on maps they'd de-drawn weeks ago when the front lines were supposed to be somewhere else. The war had moved fast. The breakout from Normandy had been faster than anyone expected. The Germans were supposed to counterattack. Instead, they'd been broken, scattered, pushed back toward the Rhine. The feeling across the Allied command was almost giddy. The war was supposed to end by Christmas. Everyone said so. Officers, enlisted men, politicians, newspaper correspondents, the Germans were finished. It was just a matter of mopping up. But the Ardennes didn't feel finished. The forest had a quality of waiting, of holding its breath, of knowing something that the soldiers moving through it didn't know yet. Brennan's patrol had been in the forest for 2 days. 12 men moving carefully, staying off main roads, avoiding German positions, mapping the area for the larger force that would be moving through in the coming weeks. Intelligence said there were maybe 200 German soldiers scattered across the region. Not enough to be a real threat, just enough to be a nuisance, enough to delay, to create friction, to make the Allied advance take longer than the 3 days command estimated. Kowalski had been with Brennan since North Africa. They'd landed together at Kasserine Pass in February 1943. They'd fought through Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and now France. Kowalski had survived when others hadn't, not because he was lucky, because he was careful, because he noticed things, because his instincts were better than anyone else's in the patrol. If Kowalski was pointing at the cave, there was definitely a reason. The patrol consisted of 12 men: Brennan, Kowalski, Sergeant William Cross, Corporal Frank Delgado, and 8 riflemen. Cross was a regular Army soldier, the kind of man who'd been enlisted since 1938, who'd seen the peacetime military transform into a war machine. He was 42, from Detroit, had a wife and 2 daughters waiting for him somewhere in the States, and he'd learned to trust Brennan's judgment completely. Delgado was different. He was a replacement, only 2 months in the patrol, but he'd proven himself in that short time. He was smart, he'd gone to college. He understood things that most soldiers didn't. The rest were a mix. Peterson from Chicago, Sullivan from Boston, Rodriguez from Texas, Garcia from New Mexico, Davis from Atlanta, Morrison from Virginia, Jackson from Seattle, Rivera from Los Angeles. 8 men from 8 different backgrounds, thrown together by war, bonded by the simple fact that they'd all survived to this point, and they all intended to survive a while longer. They'd been moving through the forest on a rough azimuth, navigating by map and compass, avoiding roads and villages. The Germans had pulled back fast, but they'd left behind small defensive positions: machine gun nests, observation posts, snipers. The patrol had encountered 2 German positions the previous day. They'd avoided them both. Combat wasn't the mission. Reconnaissance was. Get in, see what's there, get out, report it. That was supposed to be simple. They were supposed to be scouting German positions in the forest, mapping defensive lines, identifying supply routes. The Allies had broken out of Normandy 3 months earlier. The German army was retreating east toward the Rhine. The war was supposed to be ending. Everyone could feel it. The Germans were beaten. It was just a matter of mopping up. But the Ardennes didn't feel beaten. The forest was quiet in a way that made your skin crawl. The roads were empty, the towns were abandoned. No German patrols, no resistance, just silence. and the constant sense that something was watching from the darkness between the trees. Brennan looked at the cave. It was maybe 6 feet tall at the entrance, wider than it was high, disappearing into shadow about 15 feet back. Nothing suspicious, nothing unusual, just geology, just rock. The kind of feature you'd see anywhere in a mountain region. Germany had caves, France had caves, Switzerland had caves. This was just a cave. But Kowalski had pointed it out, which meant there was something about it that registered as wrong to him, something that didn't fit, something that suggested human activity or German intention. Could be a German observation post, Delgado suggested. Delgado had been a geology student before the war, could talk about rock formations and mineral deposits with the kind of enthusiasm that made everyone else uncomfortable. They use caves for storage sometimes. Ammunition, supplies, equipment, keeps them protected from air raids. We had lectures about it in basic German doctrine, favors using natural features when they can't build fortifications. Cross shook his head. Too small. They'd want something bigger, somewhere they could move equipment in and out without being seen from the air. This is just a natural formation, probably been here for 1,000 years. But Brennan was already moving forward, not aggressively, just deliberately. The kind of movement that said he was going to check it out, and nobody should argue about it. That was the thing about being an officer. You could make decisions that nobody could question, even if the decisions seemed stupid. Especially if they seemed stupid. Kowalski followed him. That was what Kowalski did. When Brennan moved, Kowalski moved. When Brennan decided something mattered, Kowalski had already decided it mattered too. They had that kind of understanding. The kind that developed between men who'd been in combat together, who'd seen each other afraid, who'd watched each other kill. The rest of the patrol hung back, securing the perimeter, watching the forest for German movement. This was standard procedure. You never committed your entire force to investigating something. You always kept people back, ready to provide covering fire if things went wrong. The beam caught something unnatural. Not rock, metal, rusted metal. A piece of equipment maybe, or a tool, or something the Germans had abandoned months ago. Morrison kept moving forward. Kowalski was right behind him, rifle up, ready to engage anything that came out of the darkness. The cave continued deeper, 20 feet. 30. The passage was becoming more deliberate now, more engineered. The walls were too smooth, too regular. This wasn't natural erosion, this was human work. Morrison's hand tightened on his rifle. This changed things. Caves were one thing, evidence of human activity was another. 50 feet in, the cave opened into a chamber. His flashlight beam caught the edges of it, maybe 30 feet across, 15 feet high. And in the center of the chamber, barely visible in the darkness, Morrison saw something that made his breath catch. It was a door, not a natural feature. A reinforced steel door set into the rock wall, half buried in sediment and darkness. It had German military markings. Faded, weathered, but unmistakably German. Brennan backed out of the cave slowly, keeping his flashlight on the door until he reached daylight. He didn't say anything to Kowalski. Didn't need to. Kowalski had seen it too. They both understood. This wasn't a cave. This was something else entirely. Back at the cave entrance, Brennan gathered his men. Cross was immediately suspicious. "What did you find?" "A door," Brennan said. "German, deep inside." "A door to what?" Delgado asked. "That's what we need to find out." The debate lasted maybe 5 minutes. This wasn't in their orders. They were supposed to report positions, not investigate caves. But caves with German doors were positions, in a sense. They needed to be reported, but first, they needed to be understood. Brennan made the decision. They were going back in. They were going to open that door and see what was on the other side. Cross organized the men to stay outside as lookouts. The rest moved into the cave. Flashlights off, rifles ready. Moving carefully through the darkness, guided by the slightest touch of ambient light filtering in from outside. Brennan led. Kowalski was right behind him. The darkness was absolute. Once they got more than 30 feet in, sound became everything. The careful placement of boots, the controlled breathing, the faint scrape of rifles against webbing. Brennan switched on his flashlight when they reached the chamber. The beam caught the door immediately. It was larger than he'd first thought. 7 feet tall, maybe 5 feet wide, riveted steel, hinged on the right side. And it was sealed. Not locked with a visible mechanism, just closed. Welded shut, probably, or sealed from the inside with some kind of mechanism that required access from within. Delgado ran his hands over the doorframe. "This is military construction," he said quietly. "Not new. Years old. Maybe 1942. The riveting pattern, the corrosion on the hinges, the type of steel. This has been here for a while." Brennan looked at the door, looked at the darkness beyond it. Somewhere behind that steel barrier was a room. An entire room carved into the bedrock of the Ardennes Forest. A room that had been sealed, hidden, kept secret for over a year. "We need to open it," Brennan said. "Sir, we don't have explosives," one of the riflemen said. His name was Peterson. He was 19, from Chicago, had been in 3 combat operations, had seen men die, but had never seen anything like this. "We don't need explosives," Delgado said. "Look at the hinge mechanism. It's corroded. If we put enough pressure on the door, we might be able to force it. The rust will do half the work." They tried for 5 minutes, all 8 of them, pulling, pushing, straining against the steel door. It didn't budge. The rust held it shut, like it had been welded into place. Brennan was about to call it off, about to decide they should report what they'd found, and let someone with proper equipment handle it, when Kowalski noticed something. "There's a ventilation shaft," Kowalski said. He was pointing at the upper corner of the doorframe. A thin pipe, barely 2 inches in diameter, ran up into the rock. "If this is some kind of bunker or fortification, it needs air circulation. That shaft has to go somewhere." "Could be a listening post," Cross suggested. "They monitor sounds from the forest, keep tabs on who's moving through," but Brennan was looking at the ventilation shaft more carefully. It had an open end, just disappearing into darkness above the door. No cover, no filter, just an open passage. And beneath it, on the doorframe, there were scratches. Fresh scratches. Someone had been working with tools recently. Someone had been trying to open this door from the inside. The realization hit Brennan like cold water. This door wasn't meant to keep people out, it was meant to keep people in. "We need to breach this," he said. "Right now, sir, that could trigger a booby trap," Peterson warned. "Or it could prevent German soldiers from coming out of here and slaughtering the next patrol that comes through," Brennan countered. "If this is what I think it is, if this is some kind of underground installation, then it's not abandoned. It's active, it's staffed. And we're going to open that door before the men inside know we're here." He pointed at 2 of the largest riflemen. "Get your helmets off. Tear off some strips of webbing. We're going to make a battering ram." They fashioned a crude tool from a fallen tree branch and ammunition belts. Not elegant, not sophisticated, but it would work. They positioned themselves, got leverage, and started hammering at the hinge mechanism. The sound echoed through the cave. Every blow was loud, echoing, announcing their presence to anyone listening. On the 5th blow, the hinge cracked. Metal groaned. The door shuddered. On the 8th blow, it gave. The door swung inward, opening into absolute darkness. No light came from the other side, no sound, just blackness and the smell of something wrong. Something metallic and chemical and fundamentally wrong. Brennan raised his rifle, clicked on his flashlight, swept the beam into the opening. What he saw made him stop breathing. The chamber beyond was enormous, not a small room. An entire cavern, carved out of the rock, reinforced with concrete and steel supports. And it was full of equipment, machinery, workbenches, ammunition stacked in neat piles. And on the walls, technical diagrams, blueprints, schematics, all in German. All showing something Brennan didn't immediately recognize but understood instinctively was important. "Holy Christ," Cross whispered. The chamber extended at least 100 feet back, disappearing into shadow. There were side passages, multiple doors, evidence of habitation, cots, a stove, water barrels. This wasn't just a storage facility, this was a base. An underground military base carved into the Belgian bedrock. Kowalski was moving toward one of the workbenches, drawn by something he'd seen. Brennan almost stopped him, then realized Kowalski was pointing at something. Papers. Scattered across a workbench, recent papers, notes in German, and sketches. Detailed technical sketches of something Brennan couldn't quite make sense of at first glance. Then, his eyes focused on the sketches, and understanding crashed over him like a wave. "These are rocket designs," Kowalski said quietly. "Look at this. Look at the trajectory calculations. This is artillery, advanced artillery, something the Germans haven't deployed yet." Cross moved to another workbench. "There are electrical components here. And these looked like timing mechanisms, fuses maybe, or detonators. Delgado was examining the machinery more carefully. His face had gone pale. "This is a manufacturing facility," he said. His voice was shaking slightly. "This is where they're building something. Something significant." Brennan's mind was racing. A secret underground facility, advanced rocket technology, manufacturing capability. This wasn't just a defensive position. This was a production facility. The Germans were building something out here in the Ardennes Forest, hidden from Allied air reconnaissance, built deep enough to survive bombing. Staffed with engineers and scientists who were working on weapons the Allies didn't even know about yet. "We need to document everything," Brennan said. "Draw it, memorize it, photograph it. If anyone has a camera." Peterson had a small camera, a civilian model he'd picked up in Paris. He started taking pictures, flash and bang in the darkness. Photographs that would take hours to develop, but would show command exactly what was happening in this cave. But Brennan's mind was already moving ahead. If the Germans had built this facility, if they had invested time and resources into establishing a secret underground base, then they would have protected it. They would have garrison forces. They would have defensive positions. They would have contingency plans for exactly this scenario, an Allied patrol discovering their secret. And the fact that they hadn't encountered any resistance yet was starting to feel like the worst possible sign. "We need to move deeper," Brennan said. "We need to understand the full extent of this facility." They moved through the central chamber. More equipment, more ammunition, boxers stacked with supplies, food, water, enough resources for a garrison of maybe 50 men for several months. This was a fortress, a completely self-sufficient fortress hidden inside a mountain. A corridor led deeper into the rock. Brennan moved toward it, rifle ready, knowing that with every step they were moving deeper into German territory, getting further from the surface, further from escape. But he also knew that whatever was happening in this facility was significant enough that he had to understand it completely. The corridor opened into another chamber. This one was different. It had sleeping quarters along one wall. Bunks, simple, military, but also evidence of long-term habitation. Photographs on the walls, letters, personal effects. This wasn't a temporary position. Men had been living here. Men who had made this their home, their duty station, their life. And on a table in the center of the chamber, there was a desk. And on the desk was a logbook. Delgado picked it up, started reading. His face went from pale to absolutely white. "What is it?" Brennan asked. "This is an engineering log," Delgado said slowly. "Daily entries, work progress. Technical notes. They're building something called Project Yule, Project Owl. And according to this, it's a ballistic rocket system, something they can fire from this location, from this bunker, that has a range of ... He looked up from the logbook. His eyes were terrified. 150 kilometers, with a payload of approximately 500 kilograms. "Where would it hit?" Cross asked, his voice steady but urgent. "Anywhere in Belgium? Anywhere in northern France? Anywhere within 150 kilometers of this location," Delgado responded, running his hands along the concrete walls as he spoke. "This facility can strike supply depots, command posts, airfields, ports. This is a strategic weapon, and according to the last entry in this log, the first test firing is scheduled for September 8th, 5 days away." The realization was staggering, crushing, almost incomprehensible in its scope. A completely unknown German weapons facility, hidden underground, building advanced ballistic weapons positioned to strike the entire Allied rear area. If even one of those rockets reached an airfield, an ammunition depot, a command post, the damage would be catastrophic. Hundreds dead, infrastructure destroyed, supply lines severed. The entire offensive could be halted. And if the facility could manufacture more than one rocket, if it could produce multiple weapons on a regular basis, then the entire strategic situation in Europe could fundamentally change. The Germans could turn the tide. The Germans could transform defeat into stalemate. The Germans could buy themselves time they desperately needed. "We need to destroy this," Kowalski said simply, his jaw clenched, his fists opening and closing. "We need to report this," Cross countered immediately, his military training overriding his instinct for action. "Let command decide what to do. That's above our pay grade. If we report this and the Germans find out we've discovered their facility, they'll move it," Brennan said, pacing now, thinking out loud, wrestling with the decision. "They'll evacuate they'll destroy it themselves before we can capture it. Our only advantage is surprise. We need to use it. We need to act now, while they still don't know we're down here, while we still have the element of shock." But even as he said it, even as the words came out of his mouth, Brennan knew they didn't have the resources. 12 men with rifles and grenades couldn't destroy an underground facility. They'd need explosives. Lots of them. Tons. They'd need engineers with specialized knowledge. They'd need support from division. They'd need time they didn't have, and resources they couldn't access from this deep in a cave. They needed help. They needed command to mobilize. They needed to get this information to people who could actually do something about it. "We're leaving," Brennan decided, finally, his voice taking on the absolute authority of command. "We take the logbook. We take as much documentation as we can carry. We take sketches, components, anything that proves this exists. We get back to regiment. We report what we found. We give command the information they need to respond appropriately. And then command decides how to respond with whatever resources they can assemble." They gathered what they could, working frantically, knowing that every second they spent in the bunker increased the risk of discovery. The logbook went into Brennan's pack. Technical sketches were photographed with a small camera that Peterson had brought. Components were collected and wrapped, anything that would prove to higher command that this facility existed, that it was real, that it was operational, and that it represented an existential threat to the entire Allied position in Europe. Then they began the careful process of retracing their path back through the caverns, back through the passage, back through the passage, back toward the entrance where daylight seemed impossibly distant. That's when they heard the voices. German voices, multiple men, coming from deeper inside the bunker, echoing through the rock, getting closer, getting more distinct. They'd found a back entrance, a secondary passage. The Germans had known their primary door was breached and were coming to investigate. Or perhaps the sounds of the door breaking, the footsteps, the voices of American soldiers, all of it, had triggered some kind of alarm system. Regardless, the fact was undeniable. German soldiers were coming toward them, armed, alert, ready to defend their facility with their lives. "Move," Brennan hissed, urgency transforming into absolute command. "Back to the entrance. Now move now." They ran through the cavern, past the machinery and ammunition, through the chamber where they'd found a logbook, back toward the main passage that led to daylight. Behind them, voices were getting closer. Footsteps were echoing through the rock. Flashlight beams were cutting through the darkness, sweeping back and forth, searching, hunting, intent on finding the intruders. They reached the main passage. Brennan could see the entrance, could see daylight filtering through, could see the way out. They were going to make it. They were going to get out of this facility, and a rifle shot echoed through the cavern. Deafening, violent. The round hit the rock wall just ahead of them, sending fragments flying, dust erupting from the impact. The Germans had visual contact. The Germans were firing, aimed fire, professional fire. The fire of trained soldiers intent on stopping them. Kowalski went down, shot in the leg, a clean hit. He fell hard, couldn't get back up, tried to push himself forward, but his leg wouldn't respond. Crows grabbed him immediately, tried to drag him forward, but Kowalski was heavy and wounded, and they were moving too slow for the pace required to survive. "Leave me," Kowalski gasped, pain and urgency in his voice. "Get out. Report what you found. Get the information to command." "Nobody gets left behind," Cross said, still dragging, still refusing the logical military option. More shots, coming faster now, more rounds. The German patrol had numbers, they had position. They had the entire underground facility at their back to retreat into if things went bad. They could absorb casualties. They had reinforcements waiting deeper in the bunker. The Americans had nowhere to go except the entrance, had nowhere to retreat to except the surface, had nothing except the will to escape. Brennan turned, raised his rifle, fired 3 times at the flashlight beams coming through the darkness. 3 controlled shots, aimed fire. One of the lights went out. That meant at least 1 German soldier was down, either dead or wounded. But there were more, many more. Brennan could hear them now, could hear their voices coordinating, could hear German being shouted in the darkness, military commands, orders, the systematic approach of trained soldiers. "Go," Brennan shouted at the others. "Get to the entrance. Get to the surface. Report this. Go, go, go." He stayed behind. Him and Peterson, almost safe, almost free from the darkness. "Come on." Cross was shouting from the cave entrance, his voice almost unrecognizable with urgency and desperation. "Move, move, move." Brennan grabbed Peterson, hauled him up. Peterson's arm wasn't working right. The shot shoulder had done damage, had severed something, had disabled the limb, but he could still move, could still run. They ran through the passage, through the darkness, toward the light, toward freedom, toward safety, toward the surface. The German patrol was still coming, still firing, but the passage was narrowing, becoming more difficult to navigate. The Germans had to be more careful, had to slow down, had to move slower through the confined space. That bought Brennan and Peterson the seconds they needed. The crucial seconds that meant the difference between capture and escape. They burst out into daylight, burst through the cave entrance into the forest light, fell onto the ground in front of the cave entrance, gasping, breathing hard, their lungs burning from exertion. Hands grabbed them, pulled them up, dragged them away from the opening. The two lookouts who'd stayed behind were already providing covering fire, rifles pointing at the cave entrance, ready to engage anything that came out. Two American soldiers standing between them and the Germans below, the thin red line that separated escape from capture. But nothing came. The German patrol had realized what had happened. They understood that pursuing into the narrow passage would be suicide. The Americans would be waiting. The passage was too narrow for a coordinated assault. They'd retreat back into the bunker, seal themselves inside, and prepare to defend their facility against whatever came next. Which meant the Germans knew. The Germans understood that their secret was exposed. Their security was compromised. Their facility was no longer hidden. Within hours, command would know. Within days, attack forces would be mobilized. They would accelerate their timeline. They would move the weapon system if they could, or they would activate it. They would launch the rockets from this facility and strike at Allied positions before anyone could stop them, before command could mobilize, before engineers could arrive with explosives, before anything could be done to prevent it. Brennan looked at the logbook he was carrying, looked at the technical sketches in his pack, looked at his men. Peterson was wounded, but alive. Kowalski was wounded, but alive. They'd lost nothing but time and ammunition. And they'd gained intelligence that could change the entire war, could save thousands of American lives. "We need to get back to regiment," he said. "Now we need to report everything, every detail, everything we saw." The patrol moved out. They didn't take the main roads. Too exposed, too dangerous, too many possibilities for German patrols to intercept. Then they moved through the forest, careful, slow, knowing that German soldiers might be in those trees, knowing that security around the facility was probably being tightened as they moved. That German command was probably already mobilizing reserves to protect their secret. It took them 4 hours to reach regimental headquarters, for hours of careful movement through enemy territory, for hours where every sound could mean discovery, every shadow could mean German soldiers, every moment could transform into combat. Colonel Harrison Pierce listened to their report in complete silence. He read the logbook word by word, looked at the sketches line by line, examined the components they'd brought back, turning them over in his hands, understanding their significance, and slowly his face transformed. From skepticism to concern to absolute certainty that what they were telling him was true. From disbelief to comprehension to understanding the magnitude of what had been discovered. "This is a ballistic weapons facility," he said finally, his voice steady but carrying the weight of what it meant. "Operating in the heart of the Ardennes. This is a strategic target. This is something that has to be reported to division, corps, and army immediately. This could change everything." He got on the radio. Within 2 hours, Brennan was being briefed by division intelligence officers. Within 4 hours, corps was engaged. Within 6 hours, 5th Army commander was reading the report by morning. The entire Allied command in Europe knew about the underground facility. Every general, every staff officer, every strategic planner. The word was spreading up the chain of command with increasing urgency. But there was a problem. Nobody knew exactly what to do about it. How do you attack something you can't see? How do you destroy something hidden underground? Bombing wouldn't work. The facility was too deep, too well protected. Any bombs that hit the cave entrance would only serve to seal the Germans inside more completely, would trap them but wouldn't, destroy them, would delay them but not stop them. They needed a ground assault. They needed troops on the ground who could penetrate the facility, neutralize the garrison, destroy the weapons system before it could be launched. They needed infantry. They needed engineers. They needed firepower. Division tasked the 1st Battalion of the 12th Infantry Regiment with the mission. 240 men, heavy weapons, combat engineers with explosives, trained soldiers ready to assault a fortified position. They moved out on September 5th, supported by artillery fire that would suppress any German defenses on the surface. They reached the cave entrance after 90 minutes of movement through the forest. 90 minutes under a constant threat of ambush. 90 minutes of advancing through enemy territory. The Germans had prepared a defense. There were machine gun positions covering the entrance, trenches dug in the rock, ammunition stacked for sustained fire. And they were ready. They'd had time to prepare. They'd used those hours after the patrols. Escape to fortify their position, to create obstacles, to prepare fields of fire that would make any assault extremely costly. The assault took 2 hours. 2 hours of intense combat, 2 hours of men dying. The Americans lost 17 men killed in action, 43 wounded, but they pushed through the entrance, penetrated the cave passage, and fought their way into the central chamber. The Germans fought hard. They knew what they were defending. They knew the strategic importance of the facility. They knew that if this facility was captured, if it fell into American hands, the war in Europe was effectively over. But they were also cut off, surrounded, trapped in their own bunker with limited ammunition and no possibility of reinforcement. By noon on September 5th, the facility was American. The Germans had either surrendered or died. Defending their position, there were no casualties among the weapon system. Operators they de-evacuated through some secondary passage the moment the fighting started, but the facility itself, the rockets, the technical data, all of it was captured intact, preserved, secured, safe from destruction. The engineers moved in immediately. They photographed everything. They cataloged the weapons. They documented the manufacturing capabilities, and they prepared to demolish the entire facility, to ensure that nothing could be salvaged, nothing could be rebuilt, nothing could threaten Allied forces ever again. It took 3 days to set the charges, 3 days of careful work, 3 days of placing explosives at critical structural points. On September 8th, the day the first test firing had been scheduled, the day the Germans had planned to launch their rocket and strike at the Allied rear area, the facility was destroyed. 500 kilograms of explosives collapsed the entire structure. The cavern caved in. The entrance was sealed. The bunker was gone, erased from the earth. 12,000 American soldiers in the area that day never knew how close they came to disaster. Never knew about the facility, hidden in the Ardennes Forest, never knew that a single reconnaissance patrol, following up on a strange observation, had discovered a secret that could have changed the entire war. Their units, their mission, had been saved by 12 men who decided to investigate a cave. The intelligence gleaned from the facility was classified so highly that most of the men involved in its discovery never knew what happened to the information. Brennan tried to find out. After the war ended, tried to understand the true strategic significance of what they'd found. But the records were sealed. The facility remained classified. The entire operation was buried in files marked top secret, and it stayed that way for decades, for 50 years, for longer than anyone involved could reasonably be expected to live. Kowalski survived his wound. He spent 3 months in a hospital in England, recovering, healing, learning to walk again. Then he came back to the front. He survived the war, lived until 2001, lived 77 years after the discovery. Never talked about what he'd found in the cave, never explained to his children what that patrol meant, what they'd accomplished, how close they'd come to changing everything. Peterson recovered from his shoulder wound. He served out the rest of the war with the 12th Infantry, saw action in Germany, crossed the Rhine, and was killed in action during the crossing in March 1945, 6 months after the facility was destroyed. He never knew the full significance of what he'd helped discover, never lived to see the war end, never had the satisfaction of knowing that his sacrifice had prevented a catastrophe. Cross made it home, married a French woman he'd met near Reims, lived in Belgium after the war, died in 1987. He left a detailed account of the patrol, the cave, the facility it was donated to an archive, but it remained largely unknown, lost in the vast sea of World War II documentation. Lost in millions of other stories, Brennan was promoted to captain for the facility's discovery, though the official citation never explained what he'd actually discovered, never revealed what the facility was or what they'd found, just said he'd discovered a strategic position that was subsequently captured and destroyed. He stayed in the Army, served in Korea, retired as a major, lived in Oregon, wrote a memoir in 1968 that mentioned the cave, but said nothing specific about what was inside. Army had made him sign a secrecy agreement that lasted 30 years beyond the wars. 30 years where he couldn't talk about what he'd found. 30 years of silence. In 1975, as his secrecy agreement was expiring, Brennan tried to publish a more detailed account of the discovery. The Pentagon blocked it. Classified information, they said. National security, they said. Some secrets are too important to reveal. Some secrets need to stay buried. It wasn't until 1985, 40 years after the war ended, that the facility's true purpose was declassified. It was indeed a ballistic weapons platform, a German attempt to develop a strategic rocket system that could strike deep into Allied territory. The facility had been operational for 9 months before its discovery. Engineers had been working on the weapon system for nearly a year. If the Germans had succeeded in achieving operational capability 2 weeks earlier, if that first test firing had happened before the patrol found the facility, the strategic map of Europe in September 1944 might have looked very different, might have been transformed, might have meant a very different ending to the war. The cave is still there, still hidden in the Ardennes Forest. The entrance has been sealed, the facility beneath it destroyed, but the natural cave remains. Sometimes hikers discover it. Sometimes they explore it carefully and find evidence of old military construction, old scars on the rock, evidence of human activity, and if they know what to look for, if they understand what they're seeing, they can understand that something significant happened in that darkness, something important, something that changed the course of the war. But most people who find the cave these days think exactly what Brennan S. Patrol thought when they first saw the dark opening in the hillside. It's just a cave, just rock, just geology. They're wrong, but they'll never know it. Brennan died in 1998. He was 80 years old. His funeral was attended by maybe 50 people. The obituary mentioned his military service, but said nothing about the facility. When his personal papers were donated to the Army archives, they included the original logbook, the German engineering log, that documented Project Owl, the secret weapon that never fired. That logbook sat in a filing cabinet for years. Nobody paid much attention to it. It was classified, but the classification was so old, so obscure, that it was mostly just forgotten, lost in the bureaucracy, lost in the millions of documents generated by the war. And then one day, a researcher was going through old files, looking for something else, looking for information about a different German weapons program, and they found it. Found the logbook, found the sketches, found the technical data that documented one of the most significant discoveries of the Second World War. It was an accidental find, a moment of chance. A researcher looking for information about something completely different, stumbling across the documentation of a secret that had been buried for 50 years. That researcher published a paper. The paper got attention from military historians. Historians became interested. And slowly, over the course of years, the story of the cave and the facility and the patrol that discovered it began to emerge, began to be pieced together, began to be understood. But by then, all the men who'd been there were dead or very old. Nobody could provide firsthand accounts. Nobody could fill in the details that only the men involved could have explained. The cave is still there. The facility is still destroyed, and the forest has grown back, has reclaimed the area, has made it impossible to see any evidence of what happened there. Nature has healed the wounds of war. The Ardennes Forest looks the same as it did before the war, the same as it did when Brennan's patrol was moving through it, looking for a cave. The trees are the same. The rocks are the same. The hillside is unchanged. But if you know where to look, if you know what happened, you can still feel it. You can stand in that darkness and understand that something terrible and significant happened in this space, something that mattered, something that changed the course of history. And somewhere in an archive, in a filing cabinet, there's still a logbook written in German, documenting the construction and progress of a secret weapons facility, a document that 13 American soldiers discovered because one of them happened to notice a cave entrance and decided it was worth investigating. That's all it took. One observation, one decision, one moment of attention to something that seemed insignificant, and everything changed.